Okay, sorry for the delay, and thank you everybody for waiting. So we have a conference today with Mark Kuckelberg and using Wittgenstein for thinking about the meaning of technology. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for your interest in this talk. I'm very happy to be here and very happy to talk to you afterwards about philosophy of technology. Let me start with the presentation. So basically my background is philosophy, but really specialized on technology. And I'm also here as president of the International Society for Philosophy and Technology, trying to take a more global approach in the sense that we like to network more with people outside Europe and the US. And I'm also quite involved in policy making related to new technologies, the future of technology. And so this philosophical intervention, if you like, is part of thinking together with other people about what should be the future of philosophy of technology, what kind of approaches should we have in the field. There I should mention that the kind of philosophy of technology that I was educated in was very much and is very much one of the empirical turn. Turning to concrete artifacts, to the materiality of technology, rather than only talk about technology in general. And some people do more empirical research or relate more to science and technology studies than others. But this is a bit the background. And then my question was like, okay, we talk all the time about these artifacts, but what about language? What is the role of language vis-a-vis technology? How can we think about technology in relation to language, and more generally also, how can we relate it more to the social and cultural perspectives that are around? In particular, my response was and is to the work of Don Eide, who is influential in the field in the direction of post-phenomenology. And so my comment on Eide is, well, you have been actually inspired by Ricoeur, who worked on language, but you used that for material hermeneutics, but you lost on the way, you lost attention to language. So how to bring in language is definitely a question. And then an obvious direction to go with in philosophy then is, of course, to learn from philosophy of language, who are doing nothing else than thinking about language. But the problem there is, as I see it, that both in the analytic field as in more postmodernist continental philosophy, the emphasis has always been on text, on science, on words and so on, which is quite natural for philosophy of language. But then the question is, yeah, but what about these things? What about the material artifacts? So from both sides, I wondered, like, okay, can we bring this philosophy of technology focused on materiality and this philosophy of language focused on only these linguistic elements, can we bring them somehow together? And so in articles and in my book, Using Words and Things, I have tried to do that. And one big inspiration for me was there Wittgenstein, in particular the later Wittgenstein. Investigations, uncertainty, I find very inspiring to think about language, but also to think about technology. And so that's what I want to do in this talk, to explain how I think we can use Wittgenstein in philosophy of technology. Use the later Wittgenstein. So I also did some organizational work, like this workshop on Wittgenstein and technology, to attract some people who might want to work on it, because I think there's lots of work still to be done. So it's more a programmatic paper, this paper. And I should also stress, before I do the work, so to speak, is that for me, it's not just using Wittgenstein to say there's technology and there's language, and then we use Wittgenstein to understand the language part. No, it's using Wittgenstein to bring together technology and language, and particularly to find a new approach in philosophy of technology. So it's more, one could say, a methodological interest also in Wittgenstein. It's not just what Wittgenstein says about language, it's like the way Wittgenstein thinks in his later work that I think would be nice if we can use that in philosophy of technology. Familiar concepts to you maybe from the later work, language games, form of life. Slightly less used and familiar maybe is the term grammar. I also think it can be very useful for philosophy of technology, so that will be my focus. And the structure of the argument is to first find out, and I will go more quickly here because many of you might know that, what Wittgenstein says about language. But of course, it's always a reading, it's an interpretation. And then using that understanding of that kind of the way Wittgenstein thinks about language for thinking about technology. So this is what I will do. So let's get started. So what does Wittgenstein say about language? I think his general approach is use-oriented and is holistic. This is a famous quotation where he says that meaning depends on the use. And he compares language actually with an instrument. So words are a kind of tool. And he really literally says that, so when I will use the metaphor later, this is not coming out of nowhere, it's really based on Wittgenstein's text also. And here is also interesting for philosophers of technology because he uses very concrete examples of tools. Holistic because he says that the use of language depends on the language games and form of life. The language game is for him a kind of whole where all these activities are part of. And so for him, the meaning of a word needs always to come also not just from this one word, this one element, but from the whole. So meaning is holistic. Form of life, for me, the way I interpret it, is that it's a bit broader than games. Games I connect to specific activities, like for example, giving this talk as an activity, giving a talk also if we generalize. But form of life for me is like, well, something like the Brazilian form of life, or it could be the academic form of life. So it's closer to what we call culture, but maybe we should not use the word culture. I will come back to that. So holistic, use-oriented. And why I say we should not use culture is because culture is often reified as if it's something isolated from use. And I think if we take a really use-oriented view, then we should relate it always to use. So if Wittgenstein is right that meaning lives only in use, then one could also say culture only lives in the use of words here when we talk about language. Then I also add an interpretation, and here it gets more controversial probably, to say that Wittgenstein can be read as making a kind of transcendental argument, not a transcendental argument as in Kant, or not something that's abstract or removed from reality or is in a different sphere, but rather, so not transcendent, but transcendental in a kind of limited sense. I use it just as a kind of argument, making an argument about conditions of possibility. So X is condition of possibility for Y. And in that sense, I think there is something to it. Also, conditions of possibility of phenomena then. And for that we can find support in the investigations where we find the phrase that we're not looking at phenomena, so not phenomenology in the sense of looking at the phenomena, but at the structures, the possibilities of phenomena. And there he uses the term grammatical inquiry. So it's something, the question for him seems to be what makes the phenomena possible. And I think that this, as I will explain, could be also very useful kind of approach for philosophy of technology. Grammar should be also, of course, explained. What does he mean by grammar? What do I mean with grammar later in the paper? Well, grammar, the common use, ordinary use is always refers to syntax. And that's one meaning of grammar, because it's how to put different components together. And as I will say, we can also use that in philosophy of technology in the sense, as Nordman uses it, that one can also put together not only words, but one can put together different things. And so we can talk about the structure of technology in that way. But there is also grammar in a more vaguer sense, vaguer because it's more about the meanings that are attached, the connotations that are attached to words, in this case, because we're still in language. And this is a use of the word grammar that I also found in this quotation, and that's less easy to make explicit, this kind of knowledge. And I would say we can also then give it the meaning of a transcendental condition. This will all become clearer, I think, in the case when we talk about technology. I also add the aspect of normativity, because and to the extent that Wittgenstein is talking about rule following, we can say, yeah, rules are of course normative. So we're talking about meaning here, but there's always a normative side to it. And this I find interesting as a philosopher that has always been interested in ethics, ethics of technology than now, but also before ethics. So one could say that there are different normativities in a form of life. And in the case of language, because we're still talking about language here, it's very easy to understand for people if you learn a different language, like you learned English. Otherwise, you would not be able to understand me. I learned other languages too, unfortunately not Portuguese. But so the meanings that are there have a normativity. If you want to say something in your own language or a different language, but it's particularly clear with a different language, you have to say it in a certain way. Because if you don't say it in a certain way, people will not understand you. Yeah? So if I imagine that I know 5 words of Portuguese, which is probably true actually. If I put them in a sentence, but I just mix them up randomly, and I go on the street, and the person will not immediately understand me. Yeah? But it's not only about this kind of grammar, but also about things like, imagine I learn more your language, and after a while, one of you makes a joke on the table. Yeah? We have lunch, someone makes a joke. To understand this joke, that is what I mean by this other kind of grammar, the depth grammar, the transcendental, the form of life, one could say. Because to really understand a joke often requires so much more implicit knowledge, so much more really living in a society. And so this I find interesting for thinking about language, but then later also for thinking about technology. Last point, implicit knowledge. So it's not only in language use knowing some facts and knowing some kind of dictionary knowledge. It's knowing how to say things, and more generally, when we get to technology, it's a lot about knowing how to do things. Here it's knowing how to do things with words, one could say, but later on also how to do things with tools, for example. This is it's you can instruct someone, but to really know how to do it, how to drive a car and all other kind of skills, playing music, but also the use of words, you actually have to do it. And it's through the doing and through the performance that we gain this kind of implicit knowledge. And so this is necessary for understanding jokes and more generally for knowing a language. So this is very short, of course, and there's a whole reception history of Wittgenstein, and some of you may not agree with some interpretations of Wittgenstein, but this is my working account. And so then what I did is then to say, like, let's use this working account of what Wittgenstein says about language for thinking about technology. So what happens then is that we take the same quotations, but we turn the metaphor around. And we say, like, it's not only that language is like technology, as Wittgenstein argues, but technology is also like language. Language and meaning understood in a Wittgensteinian way. So this means then that we can talk about technology in different ways, but one way is to talk about it as artifacts or tools. And then the metaphor, the turning around, works quite well, because then one can use the same vocabulary of Wittgenstein and say that, well, we need actually a holistic approach to technology, because all these different tools, this computer, the chairs and so on, they're not isolated artifacts, as sometimes is suggested by some accounts in philosophy of technology that are so focused on things. No, they're actually always part of human activities. And one can then link these activities also to games and to forms of life. And here I can get more concrete, because we're talking about technology. I follow what happens in technology, for example, in the field of robotics. Well, if we have this robot, it's Asimo. I also talked to the person who invented this robot. Asimo is a humanoid robot, and it's a robot that's designed as a social robot, meaning that it's supposed to be able to have social interaction with people in a more natural way. So the question is, like, how do you do that as a designer, and what does it really mean? Well, I think what it means, one of the things that are the challenges is that if we look at the kind of interactions here, that if we look at humans, they are really governed by rules and by the games that we play. Like, for example, meeting someone, saying hello. We don't all the time have to think about this anew, how we do that. There are already rules and there are ways how to do this in our culture, in our society. So if we have this robot doing social activities, then this kind of more holistic approach comes into play to give meaning. So if the robot comes to us with his drink, we can give meaning to this by itself lifeless artifact, what it does, because we already have this social knowledge in the form of the rules and in the form of the implicit knowledge also. So my point is that this artifact is only meaningful because we have already the form of life, because we have already the grammar that's there, and that must be presupposed because it's a kind of condition of possibility. So there the transcendental comes in. So technologies are really part of what we do and what we are. It relates also to identity. This means that also this background, this grammar shapes our expectations. So we will expect from the robot something, and if it doesn't meet our expectations, there's friction. It's the same with people. The difference is, by the way, that the robot cannot have so easily this implicit knowledge, and maybe can never have some kind of implicit knowledge. So this we can talk about. This relates, of course, to the big question whether artificial intelligence and robotics can be can reach a level where it's human-like. But I think this vocabulary enables us to talk about that. I also refer to Langdon Winner, an American philosopher of technology who also interacts with more empirical approaches. It has a very interesting view on the politics of artifacts. And here is something that's not so often quoted from him, namely that an argument where he says that technologies are woven into the texture of our lives. And he uses actually also Wittgenstein's term form of life there. But it's a kind of suggestion. It's not worked out, it's not systematic, and I want to make it much more systematic. So we can then say that the meaning of technology is a meaning that, just like the meaning of language and the meaning of words, the meaning of technology and the meaning of tools lives in use, makes possible use, shapes use, and it's usually not so, it's not always totally formalizable, this meaning of technology. So this is applying this framework. And the previous examples that I gave, the social robot, were more examples of the particular activities and games, like bringing someone a drink. Here I want to give more examples of the form of life and the grammar. And this has to do with all kinds of meanings that are somehow around in our culture and our societies. For example, so if we take this holistic picture, if we look at a robot in the shape of a woman, yeah, we do not only see a machine. There are all kinds of meanings that come with it that are related to gender relations. And yeah, this is I think for me this shows that there is this wider grammar. Otherwise, we could not make sense of many of the reactions of people. For example, if you have this female-shaped robot that does hoovering, then many people find this controversial. Say, like, why is this robot is doing service work and it's a woman? Why is it a woman? And so. To make sense of what this objection says, we cannot just look at the inner workings of the machine or the design as such. It has to be the design in the wider sense that what's designed here is also the gender relations that are given shape and that I referred to. Here another example is a robot that was a robot dog, and it was kicked, and then people reacted like, well, you shouldn't do that to the robot. Again, one can say it's just a machine, and why is this happening? Well, to understand, to explain again why people have this reaction, we need again this more holistic view of meaning and put this technology in the context of, for example, human-animal relations, where we have ideas about, for example, how to behave towards dogs or pets in general. So we can only have this discussion because there is this grammar, because there is this transcendental condition that makes possible our meaning giving to technology and our talking about technology. Labor and slavery are also meanings that often come into the debate of robotics. So there, the very word robots, of course, but also the way people talk about the robots, like the robot should be my slave, should do the household work. If people use the word slave, then that word ties into a whole history, of course, and a whole a whole area of meaning which is studied by, for example, post-colonial studies. So we cannot just remain neutral when we speak about technology, but not even when we use technology, because in the interaction we give meaning to the technology, and we interact not only with the technology, one could say, but we interact with this whole field of meaning, this wider grammar. Before using World of Things, I published New Romantic Cyborgs, where I made links between the history of Romanticism and the way we use technology today, especially information technology. So this is also, one could interpret this as an exercise in trying to reveal some of the grammar of technology, the less visible grammar that's there, but that gives meaning to what we do. For example, when we very romantically use technology to escape from reality, because what we find reality too boring, not interesting enough, and we use technology to go to a different reality. This is romantic not in the sense of romantic relations between men and women, but romantic in the sense like in 1800, in the beginning of the 19th century, how the writers and artists thought about romanticism. So I will not say too much about this here because this is another talk, so to speak. But it's again an attempt to say something about the wider grammar and background. So there are these patterns, these grammars around, and it's not just the grammar of composition. It's not how do I put the different parts of the laptop together, or how is the laptop composed, but it's how is my use of the laptop, how is use perspective in a Wittgensteinian way, how is this use of the laptop, how is that related to the way we do things. And that can be, in the case of the computer and the laptop, there's a whole culture around computing, and without knowing this, you have only part of the meaning of technology if you only have the technical part. We can then, as philosophers, we can reveal these grammars. So this is already part of this description. I think this is what many Wittgensteinians would say is what a philosopher can do. A philosopher can describe and look at how things are done. Does it mean we have to accept it? I don't think so, but we can first make clear how we think about technology in this case. It could be about all kinds of things. And like this, become more critical. Also, I've been the last years talked a lot to artists, because I think that philosophy is one practice which works with language and text, but it's good to also look at non-verbal and non-linguistic and non-text based practices, I think, to reveal this more vaguer, implicit kinds of knowledge that are there and meanings that are there, and to maybe also push the boundaries of that, like how far can we go before something becomes nonsense, before something does have no meaning anymore. To what extent can we create new meanings, given that always we have the grammars that are there? I think this is interesting for philosophers of language, but also for philosophers of technology and for philosophy of art. What can art do there? Also with the notion of use. When is something use, and when is it non-use? What is the outside of use? What is non-use? And so I think artists can do help us to think about this. So then it means that as philosophers we can describe, we can also help to change the games, the technology games, the way we do things with technology. But in order to do that, as I said, we first need to understand. And I also think that the change cannot be very big always. When it comes to meaning and when it comes to really changing the grammars. Because we can have a new iPhone, we can have a new technologies, but to really change the whole meanings that are attached to technology is the same question as asking, can we change our society? Can we change our culture, the way we do things? And you just see that the best analogy to describe this possibility of change is maybe Wittgenstein's riverbed analogy, where he says, like, yeah, there's the beds of the river, they only change very slowly, but the river just keeps going through, and each time takes a little bit. And I think this is a good metaphor to see how cultures change. But again, it doesn't mean that we cannot try to change the game, that we cannot try to change by also talking to designers, for example, trying to make new technologies, because every technology will have another use, and this use will somehow be slightly different than the uses that are already there, will maybe tap into different meanings, and so there will be small changes. And so we can, in this way, by describing, we can help maybe also as philosophers to change the game. As long as we don't go for the Platonic temptation to, in a totalitarian way, change the whole of society at once, I think this is fine. And this is something maybe that's task and a duty. So to conclude, I started with this gap between different things, between language technology, between thinking more, one could also say thinking in the humanities and thinking more about things in the engineering. How can we bridge this gap? I think this was just a small contribution to trying to bridge this gap, sorry. I think it's important to first try to reveal these larger orders like the grammars and form of life, rather than immediately, as some of my colleagues do, really in philosophy of technology, to only talk about the artifact. I think we need to take this more holistic approach, and then we can help to change the game. Thank you.
Question?
Yeah, so thank you for your talk. I would like to know more about the implicit character you told about tools. Because I can understand that in language, I can learn implicitly a word or the using of language, but when I create, when someone creates a tool, he has an explicit intention for it, right? In the design of the tool, or even in learning to use a tool. When I have a hammer, when I was a child, someone told me, you should use the hammer as this. It makes explicit the instructions, and then in the usage, it will become implicit to me, right? I wonder if you could talk something about this or more on the implicit character of technology. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. So in language, one way it goes is to simply try out things. So if you have a child, you don't have the Wittgenstein, of course, argued against nominalism, and the way that if you see a child learning, they just try to speak. They speak, and the way also as an adult, if you want to learn a foreign language, you have to just do it and then make mistakes, but it doesn't matter, and by doing it, you learn. And the same is with technology. For example, learning to drive a car. So it's learning to use a car, but the use is very much, I would say, you have first the instruction. So I follow a bit the model of skill acquisition from Dreyfus, Hubert Dreyfus. Who died last year in April. You first have the instruction from the driver instructor, but after, in the end, or one could say in the beginning, from the very beginning, one has to actually do it. One has to shift the gears and feel and hear what's happening. And this is the only way to get this specific coordination and to learn this skill. So you have the instruction, but there's always that also. So I think it's in all kind of areas of life, but with our interaction with our material environment and our technologies, it goes very much like that. And you cannot make it totally explicit. if you could, and there wasn't this process of skill learning. I would be very happy, of course, if I could play the electric guitar immediately like a very famous rock star. But no, I have to spend many hours on training this skill, and it's an embodied skill, and it's a very the kind of knowledge that I acquire is really by doing it. And it goes slow, and it's not something that someone can explain to you, not in a YouTube video, not in a teacher. You need the explanation, but you need much more, and this much more goes through use, through the use in the broader sense of the word. Quite apart from whatever intention I may have, I have, of course, a general intention to learn to play the guitar, or to learn a particular kind of music or piece, but what really goes on is the process towards know-how rather than only know that, and this is what I stress here.
So thank you. I agree, of course. And then I have another question. Yes, but it's funny because we humans, we give the instructions explicitly, right? And after we learn driving implicitly. So I think there are the two sides of it, but it's interesting. But on artificial intelligence, do you think that this implicit character of knowledge is a limitation to artificial intelligence, or there is another way of knowing how that can be implemented on artificial intelligence? I don't know if you have any reflections on this.
Okay. There is nowadays much more machine learning going on, but there are different ways that this is done, and one way that looks more similar to the way that humans and animals learn things, I think, is not so much to have these neural networks that work with symbolic operations, but more for example, a robotic spider that tries out how to walk best. This is very kind of bottom-up, starting an interaction with the environment. And so there are roboticists who apply a more an active approach, an active embodied cognition approach. And so that, I would say, is much closer to the way we do it. Whether that really is enough with regard to the question of meaning is a different question. And I think the robot or the artificial intelligence will only obtain limited kind of knowledge, and not when it comes to the implicit knowledge, by definition it doesn't have this kind of knowledge. So there it's limited. But this is a very quick answer. It's a research field on its own, I would say. But yeah, but I think this kind of terms help to frame the problem there. Like what could be the challenges there?
Yeah. Okay. My name is Plinio from Unifesp. No, I'm curious about your project. So, I mean, I don't know much about philosophy of technology. I know a little bit more about Wittgenstein. So my question comes more to understand your use of Wittgenstein, yeah, which is, I mean, a bit surprising, I would say. Because when I think about philosophy of technology, I think there's a lot of empirical in it. And Wittgenstein's philosophy is mostly remarks about concepts. So when you expect someone using Wittgenstein to think about technology, you expect, I mean, I'm wrong, that's why I want to understand. I mean, not to think about the thing, I mean, a computer or any other artifact, but about language in technology, what kind of conceptual confusion is when we talk about technology that should be dispelled, or, you know, in order. So that's what I would think first. So I mean, if it's an empirical investigation, it's not Wittgensteinian. If it's Wittgensteinian, what kind of conceptual confusion you want to work on? So that's, to understand this, how do you combine these two aspects?
Thank you for your remark. It's of course a very big question, how we should interpret Wittgenstein's general approach, right? If that combines with empirical research or not. Two parts of my answer. One is that yes, we can. So here I focused on turning the metaphor around and going to immediately to understand the meaning of the artifact. But as I said, we can also look, of course, in language use in technology. So it's also technology plus language, and that can also help already to get out of confusions that are in the discourse about technology. For example, we can talk about what do we mean when we say that a robot is not just a machine, and we can talk then about we then can do philosophy of language about this, and we can use our insights there. We can think about the meaning of machine. We can the semantics of that. We can think about what a person wants to, what's the aim of the person by using these words and things like that. And I think the discourse about technology in our society can be analyzed and can be so there's a lot of work to be done there. But I really want to also talk about the meaning of the artifact, and there. You say that Wittgenstein does not do empirical. Of course, he in his writings, he uses the technology of writing and text. But he was also someone in his life who really, he studied engineering. He, obviously in the text, there's a lot of technology there. He knows, he's interested in the empirical world, one could say. So I don't see that it would be a contradiction to connect to empirical research. The precise ways this has to be done, and that you can still call it Wittgensteinian, that's a different question. My personal approach there is to say I don't care so much what is Wittgensteinian or not Wittgensteinian. That's a game.
Yeah, you're using him.
You're playing, but yes, but I'm using him, and so I'm using not to play the game. What did Wittgenstein mean? But to play the game. What does technology means, and how can we think about the meaning of technology? And so this is a kind of way of getting out these discussions. But I don't only want to get out of them. I think maybe if we I and other people that are not Wittgenstein scholars for their whole life already, I think we can learn from this kind of discussions, because maybe if you say, for example, this use of the term grammar, for example, I interpret it different, or in the literature on Wittgenstein is interpreted different. Maybe we can also learn about to use the term for thinking about technology. We can learn something from that. So I'm not I don't want to close it off, but just to say, like, this is the game I play, and not the game of the Wittgenstein scholar trying to see what did Wittgenstein really mean.
So just another question, less methodological, something more substantial than. Do you use, for instance, Wittgensteinian reflections about emotions, other minds, the relation between the inner world and the external world, so inner process needs external criteria to think about robots, for instance? That's one, that's not method. And the other one that I'm curious, because Wittgenstein, as far as I know, he was an engineer. He didn't discuss much about technology, but he had very pessimistic opinions or views about the modern society and science. So do you use, or do you endorse his views on this modern scientific society, his pessimism? Because you said we can become critic. He was a critic of this kind of society, maybe in the conservative way, but he had a critical view. Do you explore also these, not only the method, his main concepts, but let's say.
Okay, thanks for these questions. To start with the second question, I did not specifically read his views on these matters. From the way you described it, sounds like he was very much like many 20th century thinkers, quite pessimistic about technology and modern society. And some of the concerns are valid, but the general pessimistic outlook is something that, like many contemporary philosophers of technology, I want to go beyond. I want to take a more constructive approach. So that I would not go that direction. The first question, can you remind me again?
No, I mean about robots and meaning of artifacts. So I mean he has a lot of reflections about human beings, internal life, emotions, and so on. So his philosophy of psychology.
Yes, like in Uncertainty, the way he kind of deconstructs this inner-outer distinction. This is quite, that's more philosophy of mind, I guess. But I'm interested in that because I think it can lead to a less dualistic way of thinking. And then the question is, what does it mean for robots? I definitely think that at first sight it helps people who want to build this kind of more intelligent machines, because then we don't need so much the inner psychological thing at first sight. But on second thought, I think there's more to it. It's not that Wittgenstein wants to say that there is no thinking going on. It's just that he criticizes our picture we have of the in the head versus outside the head. It's very interesting. So, for example, the metaphors, or more, no, it's actually not even metaphors. He says something like we think with our hands, and we think with other things outside the brain or outside the head. So I think for philosophy of mind and so on, this is very interesting. But I didn't immediately apply it to technology, but I keep it in mind. So.
Yeah, just one last question then. Because when you were talking, I started to wonder. I mean, if the notion of to follow a rule applies to a robot. For human beings, of course, it's essential for us. But does a robot follow a rule?
That's a good question, and I think as far as I understand what Wittgenstein wanted to say, but again, we can have a long discussion, is that following a rule is not just a mechanical process, right? And then many people who have been thinking about rule following would say that we have the freedom not to follow the rule, or we have the freedom, I would say, to improvise. And this kind of things, like improvisation, for example, leads back to this more implicit knowledge and know-how and so on. And I think there, the machine, this kind of spontaneity and freedom and this kind of capacity to improvise, we humans are very good at it. Because we have this capacity to have this implicit embodied knowledge. And so the robot, as far as I can see, is really not rule following in the way that we do it.
I want to ask a question about. I'm a mathematician from USP, and I have research about apprenticeship of child and young people and adults also in the difficulties attached to the apprenticeship of mathematics. You consider that your approach is in your framework, you can consider mathematics as a technology, the language, the coding of mathematics, and aid people to understand the use of mathematics as a kind of technology. Because even in old mathematics or postmodern mathematics, contemporary mathematics is always elaborated as a coding. Anyway, it's a coding. But this coding is a technology. And the people don't see the primary cognitive sense in the coding of mathematics. How it would be possible to aid people in this approach to understand that mathematics is also a technology, an instrument, an extension of our cognitive tools.
Yeah, thanks for that question. This is definitely also the direction I would think, because rather than thinking that there are these mathematical stuff somewhere in some kind of outer worldly place or something, we should see it in connection with the human always, and it's definitely can be seen as a technology. Also, language can be seen as a technology, and this is also explored in my book, using words and things. I was also thinking when you were making this comment, in my book on financial technologies, I looked at the history of finance. And the history of mathematics is partly, of course, the history of finance and history of accounting. And there you see also that the mathematics, that it comes out of the very concrete practices from agriculture. You then need to, in a certain political system, you need to count for the tax, and so it has with power to do with power relations and so on. And so the mathematics, which seems very abstract, actually, if you see it more as a practice and as a use, then from that perspective, I agree with you. Then it's technology. Coding is using these symbols to do things. So it's an instrument. And the human should always be, the human user should be in there somehow in the model we make from that. So also I'm influenced by the tradition of pragmatism, which also sees abstract concepts and I guess also mathematical symbols, formulas, and so on as not something that's there prior to our practices and use and what we do in society, but something that arises out of this. So and for me, this is a useful way because it's again, just like with the technology argument for me and with the words, it brings us to a more holistic view and a more also a view that's more social, I would say. That helps us to relate our fantastic abstract thinking, which we have and do. You probably, as a mathematician, do this, and but relate it, bring it back to the ground. The ground meaning what we do together in society, what we do in practice, in our material and social relations with our environment.
Thank you.
Some more questions? It's okay. Thank you, Mark. It was a pleasure and a very good exposition.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to do this, and thanks for being here and waiting. Thanks.